Shortly after 7 o'clock on the evening of November the 8th, 1974, Carol DaRonch parked her car in this parking lot at the Fashion Mall. Shortly after began what she now calls her personal nightmare. This is her story as she related it to police. Around 7 p.m., she parked her car in the west lot near Sears, went inside. While in the mall, Miss DaRonch met some cousins, stopped to talk for a while, then walked back towards Sears. She was approached by a man near Walden's bookstore. This man identified himself as Officer Roslin, who said he had caught a suspect breaking into her car. He asked Miss DaRonch to come out to the car to check it. For the next few minutes, they walked a winding route through the mall, outside and across the street to a laundromat. The man told Miss DaRonch this was the Murray Police substation, but the suspect had been moved. He said they would have to go down to the main Murray Police Department to sign a complaint. DaRonch entered the abductor's car. While on the way to the police station, she asked for identification and was shown a badge. The abductor at this point drove to and pulled into the back parking lot of McMillan Elementary School. The man slapped handcuffs on her right wrist. DaRonch struggled. The man pulled a pistol. She jumped out of the car. The man jumped out, waving what looked like a crowbar. She broke loose, ran to the street, flagged down a passing car, and an elderly couple drove DaRonch to the Murray Police Station. The search for her abductor began. The Bundy defense maintained throughout the trial that there were, quote, gaping errors, end quote, in the testimony of Carol DaRonch. The first in the question of identification.
And it was only a very, very short period of time when it became clear to her what was happening, that she had any reason to be afraid. And at that point, she was so fearful and frightened that she probably couldn't. Her senses weren't treating her very well at that point.
Then how could 9 months later she make a positive identification of Ted Bundy?
I don't know. I don't think it's possible. I think that's asking too much of people to do, and we have our theories as to how it happened and why she did make an identification, but I don't conclude that it was because she got a good look at her abductor and was able to remember him. I don't think that happened.
11 months later, however, at the trial, DaRonch picked out Bundy as her abductor. The second point concerns the abductor's car. During questioning in 1974, she described a white or light blue Volkswagen automobile with a large tear on the back seat. During the trial, she identified the picture of a brown Volkswagen. It was also established in the trial that Bundy's car did not have a tear on the back seat. The third point involves the badge shown her by the abductor. DaRonch, at different times, gave 4 different descriptions of this badge. The fourth point, police lineup, which included Ted Bundy, was held on September 5th, 1975. On 2 occasions, just 1 day before and 3 days prior to this lineup, Miss DaRonch saw pictures of Ted Bundy and testified later that she could have picked him out of the lineup based on those photographs. This is key, according to the defense, because Bundy was convicted of abducting Carol DaRonch based on her ability to pick him out of that police lineup. This conviction was recently upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court, and as far as the prosecutor, David Yoakum, is concerned, Bundy is the guilty party.
There's no doubt in my mind, and of course the court so found, that there was no reasonable doubt with regard to his guilt. He's an individual that it's probably impossible to describe. I've talked to a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists that studied him while he was at the state prison, even before he was sentenced to the prison, and read all their reports. I've probably read everything that anyone's ever said about Ted, and I think he's just an individual that is impossible to describe. What motivates him, what causes this, what I think is very deviant behavior, I don't think medical science will ever find out until he opens up his own mind and talks finally about what he has done and what he is responsible for.
I think he's innocent of the things he's accused of around here, and I don't know how he was able to put up with it as long as he did. And I visited him in Colorado and saw the jail there and so on. I don't know how he stayed there as long as he did either.
Ted Bundy was arrested in Salt Lake City August 16, 1975, and charged with possession of burglary tools and evading an officer. He was arrested by Sergeant Bob Hayward of the Utah State Patrol. 6 weeks before that, Salt Lake City detectives had, in their words, focused in on Bundy after King County authorities notified them Bundy was in Utah. Ted Bundy was convicted in October 1975 with kidnapping Carol DaRonch. It was almost 1 year after the incident occurred. Almost 1 year after the conviction, the Bundy defense located in a locked cabinet what they said was a suppressed report, a report filed by a detective, Jerry Thompson, in which he says, quote, "This is a poor witness in the detective's opinion. I don't know if she could identify who abducted her." The defense claims this proves that police engineered the identification of Bundy, but Detective Thompson says he simply didn't think this report on Carol DaRonch was important, that he never intended to suppress that report. Well, what about Miss DaRonch now?
She doesn't talk about it much anymore. I'm sure it's still in the back of her mind, but I see her every now and then. I see her in the shopping centers and so forth in town and talk to her, and you can tell it's on her mind. I mean, when she runs into us guys, you can tell she wants to talk about it, but then she doesn't.
Murray, Utah is a suburb of Salt Lake City, where Miss DaRonch was abducted and where she still lives. Although the Murray police officers took me to her home, they didn't want us questioning her. They want the news media to let her get on with her life and forget the trauma of 1974. It was a moot point. Miss DaRonch was not at home. Ted Bundy's association with Salt Lake City hasn't ended by any stretch of the imagination. He still owes the state of Utah 15 years in the Carol DaRonch conviction, and prosecutor David Yoakum told me he intends to get those 15 years, even if Ted is found innocent of all other charges. I'm Ruth Walsh in Salt Lake City for News 4. From January to July of 1974, the King County area was engulfed in a wave of fear as young women were being attacked and murdered with alarming regularity. Police in the area announced to the news media that a pattern seemed to be emerging. Similar appearance, age, circumstances surrounding disappearances. The furor culminated on July the 14th, 1974, when police had their first break. On that day, 2 young women, Janice Ott, Denise Naslin, had vanished from Lake Sammamish. There were witnesses who saw a man calling himself Ted, wearing a cast on his left arm, walking away with Miss Ott. She was wheeling a yellow bicycle. The women were never seen again alive. The bike has never been found. A composite picture was released to the news media. The Ted was seen with a light brown Volkswagen. He was described as 5'7" to 5'8", neck-length hair, brown to light brown, dark tan, 160 pounds, cast on the left arm. After this picture appeared, the task force leader, Captain Nick Mackey, received one call among thousands of others. This particular caller said a man named Ted Bundy looked, quote, something like the picture and had a brown Volkswagen. At that moment, Bundy joined a growing list of almost 3,000 men under investigation. It wasn't until October 1975 that these pictures and headlines appeared. Bundy had been charged with kidnapping a woman named Carol DaRonch in Salt Lake City, and at that point, King County Police took a more active interest in him. But from that moment on, Captain Mackey kept insisting to reporters that Ted Bundy was not a prime suspect.
The media are the ones that are making him the prime suspect. We are not. We have quite a few people that look very good, and it's surprising. You get onto one person, and people tend to make their suspect fit all the aspects of Ted. But we can't work on one at a time. We've got quite a few at a time, and they all look just right down the line until we finally come to a point where they're totally eliminated.
The photograph of Ted Bundy was shown to at least 8 witnesses from Lake Sammamish. 7 positively said Ted Bundy was not the mysterious Ted. 1 said he looked something like the man. Almost a year later, the 7 witnesses were again shown a Bundy picture. Again, they said no. By now, Bundy's photograph and composite rendering were being shown routinely in juxtaposition, a fact that Ted Bundy says is the point where he was condemned. The skeletal remains of Ott and Naslin were found 3 miles from Issaquah on September the 7th, 1974. The skeletal remains of 4 other women, Healy, Rancourt, Parks, and Ball, were found on Taylor Mountain, near Issaquah, the next March, 1975. Where does this investigation now stand? Well, King County police officials will not and cannot discuss this King County investigation because it is still an active case. No one will or can confirm that the investigation continues on other suspects. Officials in the King County area are very interested in this Florida trial. If they don't actually fly to Miami to take part in the trial or to listen to it, they will keep in contact with what they call the TED Club. That's a group of law enforcement officials from 4 or 5 states banded together to share information about Theodore Bundy. I'm Ruth Walsh in Miami, 4 News 4. The legal rule of evidence called similar transaction is going to play a key role in this Florida trial as it did in the Salt Lake City trial.
The basic rule of law in the United States is that prior bad acts, whether they're convictions or not, are not admissible to prove that a person has done something in the present. That's the law. There's one exception to that, or there are a few exceptions to that, but the exception that you're talking about is what we call common scheme or plan. And that's an exception, and being an exception, the prosecution has to jump through a number of hoops before they're allowed to use that sort of evidence. The first thing they have to do is prove that there is indeed a common scheme or plan, that something that happened in the past is somehow related to what happened in the present. And I think that's clearly a very large hurdle as far as Ted's cases are concerned. Assuming that can be proven, that there is a common scheme or plan, then they have to prove that it is somehow relevant to the present charges.
It's difficult to prove. It's not acceptable courtroom procedure in some states, and it's difficult to control. A case in point is the Colorado murder of Karen Campbell, for which Ted Bundy has been charged. We flew to Colorado Springs to talk to the Colorado prosecutors. Bob Russell and Milton Blakey told me they asked to bring similar transaction evidence of 4 Utah crimes into Colorado court. One of the 4 cases, that of Carol DaRonch. The other 3, the disappearance of Deborah Kent and the murders of Melissa Smith and Laura Amy. Bundy has never been charged with the crimes of Kent, Smith, and Amy, and that fact alone made the legal rule of evidence of similar transaction peculiar, according to Bundy's defense attorney. But when I went to Salt Lake City and Murray, Utah, to talk to officials, they didn't try to hide from me the fact that they think all 4 crimes are related, although this hasn't been admitted publicly before.
Well, I think that all of the quote Ted cases that are still open, obviously. We're talking about Melissa Smith, who disappeared in 1974 and whose body was found up the canyon, and Laura Amy, a girl in Utah County who was also found missing around the same time, and her body was discovered down in American Fork Canyon, and of course the Debbie Kent disappearance up in Davis County, adjoining county, whose body's never been found. These have all been linked in some way to Ted, either by physical evidence or witnesses' testimony, and they were, I assume that all the jurisdictions still have those cases open, but they pretty well centered on Ted as the main suspect.
Bundy and his attorneys called appalling the move to have similar transaction brought to the Karen Campbell case in Colorado.
Here were all these cases that I was immediately linked with, allegedly, in Colorado. But it turns out that most of those cases that involved young women who were beaten to death and left nude in the mountains of Colorado occurred before I even left Washington State. They happened before and they happened after I was ever in Colorado. So I think that what we have here is tunnel vision. Even here in Tallahassee, there was a crime in the Tallahassee area that occurred in May of '75 that's identical to what happened in the Kyle Mega house. In fact, it involved the Kyle Mega's sister. In May of '75, I was in Glenwood Springs. So what I'm saying is that we're really looking at this thing in a very prejudicial way. I mean, not we, you, or the general public is.
They claimed Prosecutor Russell was using the headlines of this unusual rule of evidence to further Russell's political career. Defense said Russell wanted to be district attorney, a job he did run for and now holds. The prosecutor claims the similarities include abduction, nude bodies, severely beaten, little blood found in those bodies, Smith and Amy wearing only necklaces. The defense claimed more things were dissimilar. The investigating authorities established that both Amy and Smith had been held captive for a period of days and weeks before being killed. Karen Campbell, on the other hand, was killed within 2 hours of her abduction. The defense further notes that to keep the women captive would have meant Bundy needed an accomplice because Bundy has a firm alibi during those captive dates. He was on a hunting trip with his fiance's father. Neighbors of Bundy, when he lived in this apartment, also testified there were no indications that anyone was being held captive or living with Bundy during this time. Colorado and Utah authorities now add the names of Sandra Weaver, Kathy Hansen, Carolyn Sarkazians, Karen Roberson to their growing list of missing and murdered women. A coroner's report concludes that it is possible the same person or persons killed these women. At this point in our investigation, an interesting coincidence is documented. Another man was convicted of the murder of Karen Roberson and is currently serving time. He used abduction, handcuffs, and a handgun. It is believed this man was briefly investigated in the Carol DaRonch case, in which abduction, handcuffs, and a handgun were used. The files on these cases have not been closed in Utah. It's almost certain that the legal question of similar transaction will play a key role in this Florida trial, and if it does, one Seattle lawyer speculates it will be like opening a legal can of worms. It could be the basis of appeal, should that become necessary. Ruth Walsh for News 4.